The plastic bowl scraped against the concrete for the fourth morning in a row, and once again the volunteer stepped back with her hand pressed over her mouth. "He hasn't touched a thing," she whispered to Connie Farrell. 11 days. Not a bite, not a drop of water since Tuesday. Behind the bars, the big Belgian Malinois lifted his head only enough to meet her eyes, then let it fall again onto his paws. The scar along his left shoulder rose and fell with a breathing that had gone too shallow. "Connie," the girl said, and her voice cracked, "if he keeps this up, he won't be here Monday. Before this story goes any further, tell me down in the comments what place in the world you're listening from right now, and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one." Connie Farrell had been running the Hargrove County Animal Shelter for 19 years, and she had never once cried in front of a kennel. She almost did that morning. She pressed her palm to the mesh of the gate, and the dog, whose name card read Rook, Retired K9, Decatur PD, did not so much as flick an ear. 8 years of hard work, 3 commendations, a bullet in the flank that had almost killed him outside a gas station in Decatur, and now he was starving himself on a concrete slab because the only person he had ever loved was living in a 4th-floor walk-up that did not allow large dogs. Officer Paul Grady had cried on the day he brought Rook in. He had cried the way grown men cry when they are trying not to. His heart had betrayed him on the job, a valve that would not close the way it should, and the doctors had told him no more running, no more chasing, no more anything that made a heartbeat too fast. The department had a policy that said retired K9s went home with their handlers, but the department also had no policy for what happened when the handler could not take the dog. Paul had spent 7 weeks knocking on doors. His sister in Ohio was allergic. His brother in Ashwood said no. 2 families that had once seemed interested backed out when they met the dog and saw how big he was, how alert, how much he still had left in him. On the last morning, Paul had knelt on the shelter tile with Rook's head in his hands and had said, "You wait for me, buddy. Somebody good is going to come. You just wait." Rook had waited. He waited by not moving. He waited by not eating. He waited the way he had been trained to wait outside a suspect's door, all attention and no motion, all patience and no give. Wendy Alcott read about him on a Sunday. The Hargrove Gazette had run a short piece on the shelter's kennel row crisis, and buried on page 7, under a photograph of a beagle mix, was a paragraph about a retired police dog who had stopped accepting food and appeared to be grieving. She was drinking her coffee at the kitchen table when she read it. She set the mug down carefully, folded the paper along the fold that already existed, and sat still for a long time. Wendy was 43 years old. She was an occupational therapist at the rehabilitation hospital in Clarkfield, half an hour south of Hargrove, and she lived alone in the little yellow house on Poplar Street that had belonged to her grandmother. She had a fenced yard, a screened porch, and a bedroom that had been empty since her mother had died 4 years back. She had not owned a dog since she was a girl. She had not planned to own one now. But she was reading that paragraph for the 3rd time, and her hands had gone cold, and the reason her hands had gone cold was that she had been in a certain house on a certain rainy Sunday night 5 years ago, and she had never told anyone about the amber eyes and the scar. She went to the shelter on the Tuesday afternoon in late October. She wore her long tan coat with the newspaper folded in the pocket, and she took the 2-lane road through the maple trees that were shedding the last of the year's color. She parked in the gravel lot beside a pickup with a missing cat sign taped to the window, and she stood outside for a full minute before she went in, breathing the cold air and trying to name what she was feeling. The volunteer at the front desk was a college student in a shelter T-shirt. She smiled a tired smile and asked what breed Wendy was looking for. Wendy said she was not looking for a breed. She was looking for one specific dog. She said his name, and she saw the student's expression change, first surprise, then something closer to hope. Connie Farrell came out from the back office, She was a small woman in her early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up into her grey hair. She shook Wendy's hand and asked her to sit down. She said the shelter did not adopt out-working breed dogs to walk-in applicants. There was a process, there were references, there was a home visit. There was, in the case of retired K9s, a background check. Wendy said she understood. She said she would do all of it. Connie tilted her head and asked why Wendy wanted this particular dog. And Wendy, who had rehearsed nothing, told her. She told her about the rainy Sunday night 5 years back. She had been a home health aide then, filling in for a colleague on a case in a suburb of Hargrove she did not know well. The patient was an elderly woman whose son had turned up drunk. Wendy had tried to leave. The son had put himself between her and the front door with a broken beer bottle in his hand and a face she would not forget for the rest of her life. She had been backed against a wall. She had been sure, really sure, that the next thing to happen was going to be the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Then the front door had come open, and a dog had come through, low and fast, and the dog had put himself between the man and her. He had not bitten. He had not even barked, not right away. He had simply stood, all bristling shoulders and low warning, until the officer behind him had crossed the room and taken the bottle away. She had gone home and cried in the shower and had never learned the dog's name. She had remembered the amber eyes. She had remembered the shape of the scar along the left shoulder because when the dog had turned to leave, he had brushed against her leg and she had put her hand on him without thinking and had felt the ridge of it. She had remembered a young officer with dark hair and a kind voice who had told her, "You're all right, Mom, he's got you." Wendy said all of this in one breath, and then she said she was sorry for taking Connie's time. Connie took off her reading glasses. She wiped them slowly on the hem of her cardigan. She said, "The officer's name is Grady, Paul Grady, and your dog spent 8 years with him." Wendy went out to her car and sat with her hands on the steering wheel for a long time before she could drive. She did not see Rook that day. Connie had told her, gently but firmly, that there was another application on the table. A neighboring police department in the town of Beckley wanted Rook for school visits and community demonstrations. It would be a good life, structured routine, handlers who knew the breed. He would be around other dogs, and he would work in a light way, the only kind of work he knew. It was a serious application, and Connie was giving it serious weight. Wendy asked how long she had. Connie said a week, maybe a little less. That night, Wendy sat at her grandmother's kitchen table with a legal pad and made a list. It was the kind of list she would have made for a patient, the way she taught stroke survivors to break a mountain into steps small enough to climb. She wrote certification at the top. Under it she wrote reference from Paul Grady. Under that she wrote home evil from a trainer. Under that she wrote fence inspection and insurance and vet letter. She underlined the top word twice. Then she picked up the phone. The K9 handling course she found was a 4-day intensive in a town called Wolfran, an hour east. It cost $1,100, and she paid for it with the money she had been saving for a new washing machine. She told her supervisor at the hospital that she needed the days. She drove the hour east at 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning in the dark, and she came home at 9 o'clock on Saturday night with a certificate in her purse and calluses on her palms from the leash work. Paul Grady lived in a bungalow in Ashwood with a wife named Marla and a rescued cat named Elmer. Wendy called him on Sunday morning. She thought she would have to explain everything. She did not. Connie had already called him. Paul asked her only 3 questions. He asked whether her yard was fenced all the way around. He asked whether she was ready for a dog who would probably wake her up in the night for the rest of his life. He asked whether she understood that Rook would love her when he was ready and not a minute before. Wendy said yes to all 3. Paul said he would drive out on Monday and write his letter in person, in her kitchen, because a man's word on a dog was not a thing he was willing to put in an email. He came at 11 the next morning in a blue sedan, and he sat at her grandmother's table and drank the coffee she poured, and he wrote a letter in his own handwriting on a piece of shelter letterhead Connie had faxed to him. When he was done, he read it out loud to Wendy. It was a page and a half. It said Rook would need a firm hand and a soft voice, that he would sit outside the bathroom door because that was what he had always done, that he would flinch at the sound of a certain kind of siren, and that the woman named Wendy Alcott had, in the writer's professional judgment, both the temperament and the patience to make this dog whole again. When Paul finished reading, he looked up at her, and she saw the wet in his eyes, and she saw him blink it away. He put the letter on the table. He said, "There's one more thing you should know." He told her about the rainy Sunday 5 years back. He told her he had been the officer on that call. He told her that Rook had cleared the room in 3 seconds and that he, Paul, had never seen the dog put himself between a stranger and a suspect that fast, before or after. He said he had thought about the woman in the corner more than once over the years. He said he was glad it was her. Wendy could not speak. Paul put his hand on hers briefly, and then he stood up to leave. Her neighbor, Don Mallory, came over on Monday evening. He was 71, a retired dog trainer who had worked with search and rescue for 30 years before his knees gave out. He walked the fence line with a flashlight and pointed out 3 places where the wire had lifted from the ground. Wendy fixed them on Tuesday with a bag of ground staples and a rubber mallet from the hardware store on Main. Don brought his own dog Ruby by on Wednesday to test the yard. Ruby, an old golden with cloudy eyes, walked the perimeter twice and then lay down in a patch of sun. Don said, "Yard's good. You're good. Go get him." The call came on Friday morning at 9:22. Wendy was in the kitchen, washing the mug from her coffee. She dried her hands on the towel and picked up the phone on the second ring. Connie Farrell said, "Come get your dog." Wendy drove to Hargrove in a state that she would later describe as, "Not sure I was inside my own body." She parked in the same gravel lot. She went in through the same glass door. Connie was waiting for her in the reception area with a canvas file folder and Rook's leash in her hand. "The Beckley department was the second call I made this morning," Connie said. "The first call was to you." Wendy did not ask why. They walked back through the concrete hallway together, and Connie unlocked the kennel gate and stepped aside. Rook stood up. He shook himself, the way dogs shake off water. He walked out of the kennel without ceremony, and he did not stop until he stood in front of Wendy. He lifted his nose. He put his cold black nose against the palm of her hand, and then he sat down and looked up at her with those amber eyes as if to say, "Well, what are we doing next?" She drove home the 2-lane road through the maples with the dog in the back seat. He did not lie down. He sat on the bench and watched the road out the window with the sharp forward focus of an animal who had spent his life watching the road out of a window. He did not whine. He did not pace. Halfway home, at a red light in the little town of Merritt, Wendy reached back with one hand without looking, and Rook pushed his head under her hand and held it there until the light turned green. At the yellow house on Poplar Street, he stepped out of the car and walked the length of the front walk and stopped on the porch to sniff the doorframe. Wendy opened the door. He walked in. He toured the house the way a trained dog tours a house, room to room in a clockwise sweep, checking corners, checking closets, checking the space behind the couch. He ended in the kitchen. He stood in front of the bowl Wendy had put down that morning, the one she had filled at 7 a.m., with a heart full of hope she had not been sure she was allowed to have, and he lowered his head, and he ate. He ate the whole bowl. He drank half the water. Then he lay down on the rag rug in front of the sink with a sound between a sigh and a groan, and he closed his eyes. Wendy sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, and she watched him breathe. She watched him for a very long time. That was the end of the beginning. It was not the end of the story. The first week was small things. He would not lie down until Wendy sat down. He would not eat until she was in the room. He walked the perimeter of the yard 3 times before he would step off the porch to relieve himself. When she vacuumed, he sat by her feet, not afraid of the noise, just close, as if the noise was something he wanted to weather beside her. He slept at the foot of her bed. On the 3rd night she woke to a sound she did not recognize, and she sat up in the dark and saw him standing at the bedroom door with his ears forward and his back tense as a wire. She listened. She did not hear anything. She said his name softly. He did not turn to her. He walked to the front of the house and he stood in the middle of the living room for a full minute, looking at the door, and then he came back and lay down. In the morning, Wendy went out and found that a raccoon had knocked the lid off her garbage can and left tracks up the drive. On the 6th night, she woke because he was whimpering. She sat up in the dark and saw him twitching in his sleep, his paws moving as if he were running, his lip lifted. She got out of bed and she knelt down beside him and she said his name until he opened his eyes. He came awake in one breath. He put his head in her lap. He shook once, a full body shake, and then he settled his weight against her shin and slept the rest of the night with his head on her foot. She learned in that first week 3 things she had not known before. She learned he understood 42 commands, some in English and some in a language she did not recognize until Paul told her in a follow-up phone call that the dog had been trained in Dutch for arrest work because it kept civilians from accidentally triggering him. She learned he sat outside the bathroom door and would not move until she came out. She learned he flinched at a certain siren, the low whoop-whoop of the ambulance service that ran up Poplar toward the highway 3 or 4 times a week. And the second time it happened, she knelt beside him in the middle of the kitchen and put her hand flat on the base of his neck and said, "I've got you, buddy. Nobody's going anywhere." He looked at her. He did not flinch at the next one. In the 2nd week, she took him to work. She had cleared it with her supervisor. The rehabilitation hospital in Clarkfield had a policy about therapy animals, but it also had a policy about employee wellness. And her supervisor, a woman named Denise Whitmer, had signed the paperwork with a small smile. Wendy took Rook in on a Wednesday morning. She kept him on the leash. She thought he might be nervous around the equipment, around the beeping monitors, around the walkers and canes and the smell of alcohol. He was not nervous. He walked at her heel down the polished hallway as if he had done it every day of his life. He sat quietly beside her while she worked with a stroke patient named Mr. Hollis on his fine motor skills. Mr. Hollis, who had not spoken clearly in 6 weeks, looked down at the dog and said, in a slow, careful voice, "Good boy." Rook thumped his tail once on the linoleum. Mr. Hollis smiled the first full smile his wife had seen since the stroke. By the end of that Wednesday, 4 patients had asked when the dog would be back. The following Monday, Denise Whitmer came into Wendy's office and closed the door. She said, "The patients love him, your colleagues love him, but we have a problem." Wendy's heart went cold. Denise held up her hand. "It's a good problem. The board wants to know if he can be here twice a week, officially. On payroll, the dog's payroll, if he had one." She laughed. "We'll cover his food and his vet bills. Someone in fundraising already has an idea." Wendy said yes. She said it before Denise finished the sentence. That was when she thought she had won. She was wrong. The first sign was a phone call on a Thursday afternoon. She was in the driveway unloading groceries when the phone rang inside the house. She left the bags on the trunk and hurried in. Rook was at the door before she was. He stood watching her, ears up, as she picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was a man's voice, older, cordial. "Miss Alcott, my name is Nathan Kettering. I'm an attorney with a firm in Hargrove. I'm calling about a dog by the name of Rook." Wendy sat down slowly on the arm of the couch. Rook came over and sat at her feet. She put her hand on his shoulder without looking. Mr. Kettering said he represented a client whose interests, he was afraid, had been overlooked in the adoption process. The client, he said, had a prior claim on the dog. He was not, Mr. Kettering was careful to say, disputing the adoption. He was simply requesting a meeting to discuss options. He mentioned a figure. It was a large figure. Wendy did not entirely hear it. She asked who the client was. Mr. Kettering said he was not at liberty to share that on a first call. He suggested they meet at his office the following Monday. He gave her the address. Wendy said she would think about it. She hung up. She sat on the arm of the couch for a long time. Rook did not move. When she finally stood up to bring in the groceries, he stood up with her, and he walked out to the car, and he watched the road while she carried in the bags. She called Paul Grady that night. She told him about the call. Paul was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Wendy, don't go to that meeting alone." She said she would not. She called Don Mallory next. Don came over with a legal pad of his own, and they sat at her grandmother's table and they made a plan. Don said the first thing to do was to call the shelter and make sure Rook's paperwork was in order. Wendy called Connie Farrell first thing Friday morning. Connie was silent for a beat too long. Then she said, "Wendy, come in today. Bring the dog." Wendy drove up with Rook in the back seat. Connie met her in the office. She had the file open on her desk. She said, "Rook's adoption is legally final. There is no prior claim. Anybody who says otherwise is either lying or wants you to believe they can undo something they can't." She said it in a tone that had no give. Wendy asked what she thought was going on. Connie folded her hands on the desk. She said, "I think somebody wants your dog, and I think they are hoping you don't know your rights." She said that departments occasionally tried to reclaim retired K9s when a new administration came in and decided a working dog had been given away too easily. She said it had happened once, in a county over the state line, 4 years ago. She said it had ended badly for everybody. Wendy asked whether Beckley, the department that had wanted Rook for school visits, could be behind it. Connie shook her head. She said Beckley's chief was a woman named Ellen Vardis, and Ellen Vardis was one of the most decent people Connie had ever met in animal welfare, and if Ellen wanted the dog, she would have written a letter and signed her own name to it. Wendy drove home slowly. She did not go to the meeting on Monday. She had her cousin, a paralegal named Michael Alcott, who lived in Springerville, call Nathan Kettering's office instead. Michael reported back within an hour. He said Kettering was a real attorney. He said the firm was real. He said Kettering had declined to name his client. He said he had, however, mentioned that the party in question had considerable resources and considerable patience. Wendy did not sleep well that night. Rook slept at the foot of her bed. When she got up at 3 in the morning to make a cup of tea she did not want to drink, he padded into the kitchen behind her and lay down across the threshold, and she stood at the counter and watched the kettle and did not turn around because she did not want him to see her cry. The second sign was smaller. On the following Tuesday, a black sedan she had never seen before drove slowly past her house at 7:15 in the evening. She was on the porch bringing in a package. She watched the car go by. She noted the make. She did not note the plate. On the following Thursday, the same car drove by at 7:20. On the Friday after that, it drove by at 7:40. Rook was on the porch with her the third time. He stood up. He watched the car all the way to the corner. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched. Wendy called the Clarkfield Police non-emergency line. The officer who took the call was polite and helpful in a way that made it clear he thought she was overreacting. He said he would send a patrol car through the neighborhood in the evenings. He did. She saw the patrol car 3 nights in a row. She did not see the black sedan. The third sign was not small. On the Sunday, 3 weeks and 2 days after she had brought Rook home, she came out of her front door at 6:30 in the morning to get the paper off the porch, and she saw that somebody had spray painted a single word across the door of her garage. The word was whose. Just that, whose. in capital letters, in orange paint, with a question mark at the end. She stood in the driveway in her bathrobe and her house slippers, and she looked at the word for a long time. Rook came out of the house behind her. He walked the length of the driveway. He put his nose to the ground at the edge of the garage. He worked back and forth in a slow, methodical sweep. He stopped at the mailbox. He sat down. He did not move. Wendy called Don. Don came over in 10 minutes. He looked at the paint. He looked at the ground where Rook had sat. He said, "There's shoe prints in the frost." There were. 2 of them. Size 10 or 11, work boot tread. They came from the sidewalk, went to the garage, went back to the sidewalk. They stopped at the curb where a car had apparently been idling. Wendy called the police again. This time they came out. The officer was younger and less patient. He photographed the paint. He photographed the shoe prints. He took a statement. He said he would file a report. He said kindly that spray paint on a garage was almost certainly a teenage prank. He did not know about the phone call and Wendy. Wendy did not tell him. She did not know why she did not tell him. Later she would think it was because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way she was not ready for. Don stayed for coffee. He said, "Wendy, 2 things. First, we're putting a camera on your porch today. I've got one in my garage from when I was watching the raccoons. Second, you know a good lawyer?" She did know one. A woman named Regina Nash, who had helped her mother's estate through probate 4 years back. Regina had liked Wendy's mother very much. Regina answered her cell phone on the second ring on a Sunday, which was, Wendy thought, the mark of a very particular kind of lawyer. Regina came over that afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table. She heard the whole story from the beginning. She did not interrupt. When Wendy was done, Regina took off her glasses and cleaned them on her sleeve and said, "Wendy, somebody with money is trying to intimidate you. I want to know who." She asked for Nathan Kettering's number. She said she would make some calls. She said not to answer the phone if she did not know the number. She said not to open the door for anyone she was not expecting. She said, "The dog stays inside at night. Every night. Do you understand?" Wendy said she understood. Regina looked at Rook. Rook looked back at her. Regina, who Wendy had known for 4 years and had never once seen smile at an animal, smiled at Rook. She said, "Good boy." Rook thumped his tail once. The week that followed was quiet in a way that felt loud. The black sedan did not come back. The phone did not ring with any number she did not recognize. The camera Don had installed showed nothing but a possum and a paper delivery boy. Wendy went to work. She took Rook with her on Wednesday. Mr. Hollis, the stroke patient, had progressed to 2 clear sentences. When Rook came to sit beside his chair, Mr. Hollis said slowly, "How are you today?" And Rook thumped his tail twice. On the Friday night of that quiet week, Regina called at 9 o'clock. Her voice was flat. She said, "Wendy, I know who's behind this. I want you to sit down." Wendy sat down. Rook came and sat at her feet. Regina said, "Do you remember the name of the man from that night? The rainy Sunday 5 years ago? The one with the bottle?" Wendy said she did not. She had never known his full name. The officer had used a first name, Marcus, maybe. She had never seen the paperwork. Regina said, "His name was Marcus Riddler. He was the son of an elderly woman named Priscilla Riddler. Marcus Riddler was arrested that night for aggravated assault. He served 22 months. He got out 4 years ago." Wendy did not say anything. She waited. She could hear Regina breathing. Regina said, "Marcus Riddler died last February. Overdose, but his mother, Priscilla Riddler, did not die. She's 87 years old. She lives in a very large house in Hargrove. Her husband made his money in commercial roofing and left her a lot of it. And here is what I found out this afternoon. Priscilla Riddler contacted the Hargrove County Animal Shelter 3 weeks ago, right around the time your name came up on the adoption file. She wanted to adopt the retired police dog that had bitten her son. Wendy said, "He didn't bite him." Regina said, "That's not the story she's telling." There was a long silence. Regina said. "She's not going to take the dog by force, Wendy. She can't. What she's going to do, what she's already started doing, is try to make your life miserable enough that you give him up. The lawyer, the car, the paint on the garage. It's not the beginning of something. It's the middle of it." Wendy said, "How do we make it stop?" Regina said, "We make her stop wanting to do it." Wendy said, "How?" Regina said, "I don't know yet. Give me some time." The time Regina asked for was harder to give than Wendy had expected. The house on Poplar felt different now. The rooms were the same. The porch was the same. The yard was the same. But the world beyond the fence had grown teeth Wendy could not see. She began to check the locks twice at night. She began to leave a light on in the kitchen. She began to look at the driver of every car that slowed near her house. Rook noticed. Rook noticed everything. He stopped lying on the rag rug in front of the sink during the day and started lying on the mat inside the front door. He slept lightly. He was up and standing at the sound of any car door on the street. He was patient with her still when she was near, but she could see the working dog in him coming back. The shape of the animal Paul Grady had described, the animal who had cleared a room in 3 seconds. On the Tuesday of the second week, Regina called with news. She had reached out to Priscilla Riddler's attorney, Nathan Kettering. She had informed him politely that any further contact from his client's side would be treated as harassment. She had also informed him that she was in possession of the trial transcript from Marcus Riddler's assault case, and that if any narrative other than the true one appeared in any medium at any time, she would file a defamation suit with the transcript attached as Exhibit A. Kettering had listened. Kettering had said he would speak with his client. For 4 days, nothing happened. Wendy began to think, cautiously, that it was over. It was not over. On the Saturday morning of that second week, Wendy took Rook to the park. It was a bright, cold day. The oaks along the walking path had gone rust brown. There were joggers on the trail and children on the swing set. Rook walked at her heel with his ears forward and his tail high. He was, Wendy thought, the happiest she had ever seen him. A woman stopped them at the fountain. She was in her mid-70s. She wore a wool coat and pearl earrings and a scarf the color of a rose garden. She had white hair in a French twist, and she carried a small leather handbag by its handle. She smiled at Rook and asked whether she could pet him. Wendy said yes. The woman knelt down, which was harder for her than she made it look, and she put her hand under Rook's chin, and she scratched him gently. Rook did not move. He did not thump his tail. He watched her. The woman said, "He's a beautiful dog. What's his name?" Wendy said, "Rook." The woman smiled. She said, "Rook, like the chess piece." She stood up slowly. She said, "Miss Alcott, my name is Priscilla Riddler. I would like to speak with you for just a moment." Wendy's whole body went cold. She reached for the leash without thinking, and she took a step back. Rook did not move. He did not growl. He put himself quietly between the woman and Wendy, a half step forward, a shift of the shoulders, and he waited. Priscilla Riddler saw it. She did not react. She said softly, "I have not come to make trouble. I have not brought a lawyer. I have not brought anyone. I have come to see him, and I have come to see you, and I have come to ask you a question. That is all." Wendy did not trust her voice. She nodded once. Priscilla Riddler said, "My son was not a good man in his last years. I know what he did. I know what would have happened to you if this dog had not come through my front door. I want you to know that I know." Wendy stared at her. Priscilla said, "The lawyer I hired, Mr. Kettering, did not know what he was doing when he called you. He was following instructions I gave him in a very bad moment. I have since told him to withdraw. I have withdrawn." She looked at Rook. Her mouth moved as if she wanted to say something to him. She did not. She said, "Miss Alcott, may I ask you one thing? Just one?" Wendy said, "Ask." Priscilla said, "In my son's last year before the overdose, he came home and he sat on my porch and he told me that a dog had come through the door and had stopped him from ruining a person's life. He told me it was the first time in his life anything had ever stopped him. He told me he was trying to become a man who did not need a dog to stop him. He was trying. He was not doing well, but he was trying." She paused. She said, "The question I wanted to ask was whether I could put my hand on him, on the dog, just once, because he stopped my son from becoming a murderer, and I have wanted for a very long time to thank him." Wendy did not answer for a full minute. Then she said, "Yes." Priscilla Riddler knelt down again more slowly than the first time. She put her hand on the top of Rook's head. She did not scratch him, and she did not pat him. She simply rested her palm there. She said, "Thank you." Her voice was thin as a wire. Rook did not move. He watched her. She stood up. She said, "You have a good dog, Miss Alcott. I hope he lives a very long time." She turned and walked back down the path toward the parking lot. Wendy watched her go. She was leaning slightly to the left as she walked, as if her hip pained her. She got into a small blue car, and she drove away. Wendy stood at the fountain for a long time. She called Regina from the car. Regina listened to the whole story. When Wendy was done, Regina said, "Wendy, I have been practicing law for 31 years, and that is the third strangest thing I have ever heard. And that is not a bad thing." She said, "It's over." If she said it in person, unrepresented, she said it. She's not coming back. She wanted to see him. She saw him. Wendy asked, "Are you sure?" Regina said, "No, I'm never sure, but I am 90% sure, and that's more than I usually get." Wendy went home. She sat on the porch with Rook until it got dark. She thought about a lot of things. She thought about what Priscilla Riddler had said about her son trying. She thought about the phrase, "before the overdose." She thought about how easy it was to want to hate somebody in the abstract, and how hard it was to look at their mother's face and keep hating them the same way. That should have been the end of the story. It was not. The trouble that came next did not come from Priscilla Riddler. It came from somewhere Wendy had not been looking at all. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Wendy had brought Rook to the hospital for his usual visit. Denise had planned a small event, a picture with the therapy dog for the patients who wanted one, a plate of cookies for the staff. The morning had gone well. Mr. Hollis had said a whole sentence. A patient in the burn unit, a young man named Terrell, who had been in the hospital for 11 weeks, had asked to hold Rook's paw for a photograph. The photograph was good. Wendy had it on her phone. Wendy went out to the parking lot at noon to drive home for lunch. Rook was at her heel. The lot was cold and empty. There was a light snow beginning to fall, the kind that would not stick. A man was standing next to her car. He was in his mid-30s. He wore a canvas jacket and no hat. His hands were in his pockets. He was looking at the driver's side door. Wendy stopped walking. The man looked up. He saw her. He smiled a small, tight smile. He said, "Miss Alcott." Rook shifted his weight. His ears went forward. The man said, "I'm going to need you to come with me, just for a few minutes. My car is right over there." Wendy did not move. The man said, "I don't want to hurt you. I have a job to do. There's a person who wants to talk to you. She's in the car. It'll take 15 minutes, then you can go home." Wendy said, "Priscilla Riddler." The man's face changed. He said, "Who?" Wendy said, "Who sent you?" The man said, "The name doesn't matter. Please come with me." She saw then the outline of something in his jacket pocket. It was not a gun. It was too flat. It might have been a knife. She was not sure. She said, "Rook, actor." Rook came around behind her and stopped there. She said, "Rook, walk." He sat. Every muscle in him went still. His head lowered. His eyes locked on the man. The man took his hands out of his pockets. He put them up slowly. He said, "Ma'am, I don't want any trouble." Wendy walked backward, 2 steps, 3, keeping the man in her line of sight, keeping Rook behind her. She reached the door of the hospital lobby. She backed through it. Rook came in with her. The door hissed shut. She was in the lobby. There were people, a receptionist, a security guard, a family sitting in the waiting area. She said loudly, "Somebody call the police." The security guard was on his radio before she finished the sentence. The man in the parking lot did not run. He stood in the snow with his hands still up, as if he wanted to be sure the guard could see him from the window. When the 2 Clarkfield patrol cars pulled up 8 minutes later, he had not moved. He was not from Hargrove. He was not from Priscilla Riddler. He was from a man Wendy had never heard of, a man named Dwayne Merritt, who ran a small independent security company out of a strip mall in Beckley, and who, the police would learn over the next 48 hours, had been hired through a third party by a woman claiming to represent Priscilla Riddler. But Priscilla Riddler had not hired anyone. Priscilla Riddler had a live-in caregiver. The caregiver's name was Adele Winker. Adele Winker was 39 years old. She had worked for Priscilla for 2 years. She was, on paper, the sole beneficiary of Priscilla's estate outside of a small trust for a nephew in Ohio. Adele Winker had, according to the phone records the police pulled with a warrant, been in contact with Nathan Kettering's office 3 times before Kettering had made the initial call to Wendy. She had signed the intake paperwork with Priscilla's name. She had presented herself to Kettering as Priscilla's representative. She had made a small down payment for his services out of Priscilla's checking account. She had, in short, been running the harassment campaign against Wendy in Priscilla's name, without Priscilla's knowledge. The reason, when it came out, was almost boring. Adele Winker had been slowly extracting money from Priscilla for 18 months. She had gotten greedy. She had believed, how no one was ever entirely sure, that the retired police dog, the same dog that had, in her telling, attacked the beneficiary's dead son, would represent a public relations weapon Priscilla could be talked into using in some future legal fight over the estate. She had also, more simply, wanted the dog gone from the world, because in her mind the dog was a link to a story about a violent man that she did not want anyone looking too closely at. When Priscilla had gone to the park to speak to Wendy face to face, Adele had understood that her plan was collapsing. She had panicked. She had hired Dwayne Merritt through Merritt's cousin, a man named Kip Deller, who had done odd jobs for the household for years, to bring Wendy in for what she had described to Merritt as a difficult conversation with a family member. Merritt would later swear he had thought it was a family court dispute. He would not be entirely believed. Priscilla Riddler, when the police came to her door on the Thanksgiving morning, was in her sunroom with a cup of tea. She listened to the officer explain what her caregiver had been doing. She was quiet for a long time. She said, "Please, arrest her." She said it like a woman who had made a decision. She said it like a woman who had never in her life allowed herself to be a fool without correcting the record. Adele Winker was arrested in the kitchen while Priscilla was still in the sunroom. She did not resist. She looked, the officers would say later, more relieved than anything. Wendy heard the whole story from Regina on the Friday after Thanksgiving. She was sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table with a plate of leftover turkey and a glass of the wine Don had brought over. Rook was under the table with his chin on her foot. She listened to Regina, and she did not interrupt. When Regina was done, Wendy said, "What happens to Priscilla?" Regina said, "She's going to be all right. She's got a niece flying in from Ohio. She's already changed her will. She wants to talk to you." Wendy said, "About what?" Regina said, "I don't know, but I think you should go." Wendy went the following Monday. The Riddler house was a big brick colonial on the north end of Hargrove, on a street of big brick colonials. There was a wreath on the door. A woman in her 50s answered, the niece from Ohio, a schoolteacher named Barbara. She led Wendy through a hallway that smelled of furniture wax and lilies into the sunroom at the back of the house. Priscilla Riddler sat in a wingback chair with a shawl across her lap. Her hair was still in the French twist. Her hands were on the arms of the chair. She looked, Wendy thought, 10 years older than she had at the park. She said, "Miss Alcott, please sit down." Wendy sat. Priscilla said, "I owe you an apology. I have been used in my own house, in my own name. I would have said this to you sooner, but I was told by my niece that I should wait until the criminal matter was in a certain place. It is in that place. I am sorry." Wendy said, "You didn't do it." Priscilla said, "I hired the first attorney. I did that. It was foolish. I was angry the way an old woman gets angry when she is not sure who to be angry at. I am sorry for that call." Wendy said, "It's all right." Priscilla shook her head. "It is not all right, but you are kind to say so." She reached beside her chair. She lifted a small leather folder from a side table. She opened it. Inside was a check. She held it out. Wendy did not take it. Priscilla said, "It is not for you. It is for the shelter that had him. Read the amount." Wendy looked. The amount was $70,000. She said, "Miss Riddler, that's a lot of money." Priscilla said, "It is a small piece of what I have. My son cost the world a great deal. I would like to give some of it back. Miss Farrell at that shelter told me on the telephone yesterday that she had a waiting list of 11 older dogs and nowhere to put them. This will build her another kennel. It will pay for a person to run it for 2 years. Please, take it to her. From my hand to her hand, through your hand." Wendy took the folder. She could not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." Priscilla said, "Thank you." She looked at the floor beside Wendy's chair. She said, "You did not bring him." Wendy said, "I thought, after everything, I wasn't sure." Priscilla said, "It was thoughtful, but I wish you had." Wendy said, "I can bring him back." Priscilla said, "Please." Wendy came back that Wednesday with Rook. Priscilla was in the sunroom again. Rook walked in at Wendy's heel. He stopped in front of the wingback chair. He looked up at Priscilla. He put his chin on her knee. He did not move. Priscilla put both hands on his head, and she wept quietly for a long time. The winter that followed was the best winter Wendy could remember. The $70,000 check went to Connie Farrell, who wept in her office in front of 2 volunteers and swore them to secrecy about the weeping. The new kennel opened in the second week of December. It had a plaque above the door that Connie had ordered without asking anybody. The plaque read, "In gratitude for Rook and for every dog who waited." Wendy went to work 3 days a week. Rook came with her every day she worked. Mr. Hollis was discharged in the first week of December. He walked out of the hospital on his own feet with a cane, and he stopped at the front desk to pet Rook one last time. He said, slowly and clearly, "You saved a whole lot more than the ones you know about." Wendy did not know whether he meant her or the dog. She thought he meant both. The photograph of Rook and Terrell, the young man in the burn unit, ended up on the wall of the therapy room in a matted frame. Terrell came back to visit twice a month after his discharge. He always brought Rook a small piece of grilled chicken from a paper napkin. Paul Grady came for Christmas dinner. He brought Marla. Marla brought a green bean casserole and a small bag of dog treats she had baked herself. Paul sat on the floor with Rook for a full hour after dessert and scratched under Rook's chin and murmured to him in the Dutch Rook remembered from a life before Wendy. Rook lay across Paul's lap and closed his eyes, and when it was time for Paul to go, he stood up and walked Paul to the door, and he did not follow him to the car. He came back inside and lay down next to Wendy on the rug. Paul saw it through the window. Paul got in the sedan and he cried for a mile. He called Wendy from Ashwood that night. He said, "He's yours now, all the way. I saw it." Wendy said, "He's ours." Paul said, "That's a nicer way to put it. Yeah, he's ours." In January, there was a scare. Rook came in from the yard on a cold morning and he sat down in the middle of the kitchen and he would not get up. His breathing was shallow, his nose was warm. Wendy loaded him into the car with Don's help and drove 90 miles an hour to the vet in Hargrove. The vet, a woman named Dr. Cavan, ran him through every test she had. The test that came back with the answer was the one Wendy had been most afraid of. It was his heart. Dr. Cavan showed Wendy the ultrasound. She said, "It's not the worst kind. It's the kind we can manage. He'll need medication. He'll need shorter walks. He'll need you to keep him from doing anything he thinks he can still do." Wendy said, "How long?" Dr. Cavan said, "I don't answer that question honestly. I can tell you that with the medication, with the care I know you'll give him, dogs like him live for years, not decades, but years." Wendy carried him out to the car in her arms. He was too heavy. She carried him anyway. Don drove them home. In the kitchen, she made him a bed on the rag rug, and she sat down on the floor with him, and she cried quietly with her hand on his ribs. He turned his head and licked the salt off her wrist. They had a good winter. They had a better spring. Rook could not run anymore, but he could walk, and he walked with her every morning around the block. He could not jump onto the bed anymore, so Don built him a set of carpeted steps and put them next to Wendy's mattress. He climbed them slowly and settled at the foot of the bed and thumped his tail twice, which had become his way of saying, "I am here and I am well." In April, a story appeared in the Hargrove Gazette. It was on page 1 this time, above the fold, with a colour photograph. The headline said, "Retired K9 finds second calling in Clarkfield Rehab." The reporter, a young woman named Sasha, had spent a Wednesday morning at the hospital. She had watched Rook sit beside a stroke patient. She had watched him rest his chin on the wheelchair of a woman recovering from hip surgery. She had watched him thump his tail exactly once when a small child, brought in by her grandfather for the family visit, put her hand on his nose. The article was fair, and it was warm, and it did not use the words hero or angel or miracle even once, which Wendy appreciated. At the bottom of the article, in a paragraph almost like a footnote, the reporter had written this: "The dog's adoption was funded in part by an anonymous donor whose gift in the fall of last year made possible a new wing at the Hargrove County Animal Shelter. Shelter manager Connie Farrell would only say that the donor had wished to remain unnamed and that, in her words, the world is better because of some very quiet people." Priscilla Riddler cut the article out. She had it framed. She hung it in the sunroom, opposite the wingback chair. She died the following summer, peacefully, in her sleep. Barbara, the niece from Ohio, called Wendy at 9 in the morning to tell her. She said Priscilla had left instructions for the memorial. There was to be no service. There was to be a small gathering at the shelter. There was to be a large piece of chicken for a certain dog. Wendy went with Rook. Rook, who was a little slower now, who moved his head more than his body, walked into the shelter at Wendy's heel and stopped in front of the plaque with his name on it and sat down. Connie brought out the chicken. Rook took it delicately from her palm. He ate it standing up. He looked at the plaque for a long moment, the way dogs sometimes look at things they cannot possibly understand but seem to understand anyway. Then he turned around and walked back out through the glass door with Wendy. The story might have ended there. In a certain sense, it did. But there was one more scene, one more evening, one more moment that Wendy would remember for the rest of her life and would tell to anyone who asked her about her dog. It was a Sunday in October, 1 year and 11 days after she had first walked into the shelter and read a paragraph in a newspaper. The rain had come in that afternoon and had settled into a steady patter on the porch roof. Wendy was in the kitchen, making soup. Rook was on the rug in front of the sink, where he had gone back to lying in his older age, because he liked the warmth of the pilot light in the wall behind it. The doorbell rang. Wendy wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to the door. Rook was up before her. A young woman stood on the porch in a soaked jacket. She was maybe 27, 28. She had a bruise across her cheekbone. She was holding a small child by the wrist. The child was 3 years old, maybe 4. The child was crying. The young woman said, "I'm so sorry. I saw the light. My car broke down at the corner. My phone died. I don't know anyone here. Can I use your phone? Please." Wendy did not think. She said, come inside." The young woman stepped through the door with the child. Rook stood in the entryway. He did not move. He was watching the porch behind her. Wendy saw, over the woman's shoulder, a man on the sidewalk. He was standing in the rain looking up at the house. He was not moving. She said quietly to the young woman, "Is that man with you?" The young woman did not turn around. She whispered, "Please close the door." Wendy closed the door. She locked it. She turned the deadbolt. She said, "Call 911 right now. Use the phone in the kitchen. Tell them where you are." She handed the young woman the address off the mail sitting on the console table. She said, "Take your child. Go into the kitchen." The young woman went. She was shaking. The doorbell rang again, and then it did not ring, and then something heavy hit the door. Rook stood in the entryway. His head was lowered. His hackles were up along his shoulders and his back. He was not growling. He had never been the kind of dog who growled. The door held. The frame held. The deadbolt held. Wendy said, "Rook, whack." He sat. He did not move. In the kitchen, the young woman was talking to the dispatcher. Her voice was low and frantic. Wendy heard the address. She heard the words, "my husband," and "restraining order," and "a knife, I think." She heard the small child crying. Something hit the door again. The frame cracked, a small hairline crack up the jamb. Wendy did not move from her place beside Rook. She said, "You wait for the police, buddy. That's all you have to do. You wait." Rook waited. The siren, when it came up Poplar 4 minutes later, was the low whoop-whoop of the Clarkfield ambulance service. Rook flinched at it, just once, the way he had flinched 100 times before. Then he steadied himself, and 30 seconds after that, the second siren came in behind it, the sharper cry of a squad car, and a third and a fourth. The man on the porch ran. He got half a block before an officer named Ramirez took him down in a tackle in the middle of the street. He had a knife in his belt and a warrant with his name on it from another county and a level of alcohol in his system that would later, at the arraignment, become a small part of the story. The young woman on the kitchen floor was named Lena Peterson. Her daughter was named Maren. She had left her husband 3 days earlier. She had made it as far as Clarkfield, on a bus, on a train, on the last of the money she had saved in an envelope taped to the back of a picture frame. He'd been following her for 2 days. Her car, the one that had broken down at the corner, did not belong to her. It was a friend's. She had run out of gas because she had not stopped to fill it, because she had not wanted to slow down. Lena and Maren stayed with Wendy for 3 nights. They slept in the guest room that had been empty since Wendy's mother had died. Rook slept in the hallway, between the guest room door and Wendy's door. He did not go into either room. He stayed in the middle. On the 3rd morning, a caseworker came from a shelter for women in Springerville and took Lena and Maren to a place where they would be safe for as long as they needed to be. Lena hugged Wendy at the door. She said, "Thank you." She said it 3 times in 3 different tones, and none of them was enough. She knelt down in front of Rook. She put her hand on the top of his head. She said, "Thank you, boy." Rook thumped his tail once. She and Maren got into the caseworker's van. Wendy watched them drive away. She stood on the porch for a long time after the van was gone. It was cold. The porch light was on. Rook came out and sat beside her. He leaned his weight against her leg the way he had leaned against her shin on the 6th night after she had brought him home. The way he had leaned every day since, the way he leaned now. She thought about the first time she had seen him, A lifetime ago, 5 years ago, in a corner of a stranger's house in a suburb of Hargrove she did not know, when he had come through a door low and fast and had put himself between her and something terrible. She thought about the second time she had seen him, a little more than a year ago, in a concrete kennel in the shelter on the north end of town, when he had stood up and put his nose against the mesh and had recognized her without needing a name. She thought about the third time, the front door of her own house that night, standing in the entryway with his head low and his hackles up and his patience carved from something very old and very deep and very trained, waiting for a siren that was coming, waiting for her to say the word. 3 times, 3 doors, 3 moments when the world had wanted to take something from her, and this dog had said no. She sat down on the porch step. He sat down beside her. She put her arm around his shoulders. She felt the ridge of the scar under her palm. She said, out loud, into the cold air, to nobody but him, "I saw you, and you saw me." He thumped his tail once against the wood. She would tell that story for the rest of her life. She would tell it at the shelter when Connie asked her to speak at the ribbon cutting for the second new kennel. She would tell it to Paul Grady when Paul came out for Christmas the following year and every year after. She would tell it to Barbara, Priscilla's niece, when Barbara came to Clarkfield in the spring to sit in the sunroom of the house she had inherited and think about her aunt. She would tell it to Terrell, the young man from the burn unit, who came back to Clarkfield with his own dog, a shepherd mix he had named Grady in Paul's honor, and who sat with Wendy in the yard on Poplar and drank coffee and told her his own version of the story, which was, he said, mostly the same story with different names. She would tell it at her hospital when Denise retired and Wendy took her job. She would tell it when the newspaper called back for a follow-up piece. She would tell it in her own kitchen, quietly, to the young volunteer who had first fed Rook through the slot, the one who had grown up and become a vet tech and who came by sometimes on her lunch break to say hello. She would tell it eventually at the small memorial the shelter would hold for Rook, 3 years and 4 months after she brought him home. It would be an evening in late June, warm, the fireflies just starting. Connie would speak. Paul would speak. Wendy would speak last. She would stand in front of the new kennel with the plaque. She would say the same 3 lines she had said on the porch that night, in the same order. 3 doors, 3 moments. He said no. She would say he was a good dog, he was the best dog. She would say it with her voice steady because she had promised herself she would. She would say, "And the thing I want you to know, the thing I want everybody in this room to know, is that this dog was in a kennel for 11 days because nobody knew what to do with him. Because he was old, because he was scarred, because he was hard, because he was, on paper, a problem. And if a very kind woman named Priscilla Riddler had not made a very kind gesture, and a very stubborn woman named Connie Farrell had not made a very brave choice, and a very tired reporter had not written a very small paragraph on page 7 of a very local paper on a Sunday morning, none of the rest of this would have happened. He would have died on that concrete slab, and Lena and Maren would not have made it through that door, and Mr. Hollis would not have said good boy, and I would still be alone in a yellow house on Poplar Street. She would say, so the next time you walk past a kennel row and you see an old dog and you think somebody else will come, I want you to remember him. She would say, I want you to be the somebody else. And she would step down from the small wooden box the shelter had set up as a podium, and she would walk over to the kennel with the plaque, and she would sit down on the concrete beside it, and she would put her hand on the ground, on the spot where she had first knelt on the day she had gone in with a folder in her arms and a check for a woman she now missed very much. She would sit there for a long time, and a small brown and white puppy from the new kennel, 3 months old, all ears and paws, would tumble out through the open gate and up into her lap, and she would gather him in, and she would let herself cry, at last, in front of everybody. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, take a moment to leave a comment about the dog in your life, the one who waited for you, or the one who is waiting for someone right now in a place like the Hargrove shelter, and share this story with one person who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet, please subscribe. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and I would love for you to be here when the next one begins.